Yeah, welcome to the Godward podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and this episode is titled Melville, Moby-Dick, and the Blackness of Darkness. And it starts with an epigraph from the book of Jude, the not very often cited book of Jude, chapter 1, verse 13. And I strongly encourage any of you who are interested in the context here to read the whole, like Jude, I think it's like 1:8 through 14 or something, like just get the big picture here. But 1:13 says, quote, "Raging waves of the sea, foaming out of their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever." Okay. This scary New Testament excerpt comes at the end of a long warning against fleshly indulgence and sin, right before the harrowing book of Revelation. It is an exhortation to goodness and a promise of desolation for those who willfully disobey God. And it contains a favorite phrase of Melville's. He used it in reviewing Hawthorne's work, and in chapter 2 of Moby-Dick, when Ishmael wanders about the Manhattoes as he stumbles into a Negro church, he catches enough to hear that the sermon is on the theme of the blackness of darkness. Woe be unto you, mockers and scoffers. Okay, listen to this YouTube preacher from the 1980s, Bob Utley.
But these people are coming to the love feast to try to get the other young Christians involved in their loose, lascivious lifestyle. Notice it says, daringly caring for no one but themselves. Now, Ezekiel 34, 8 through 10, the literal here is shepherding themselves. And that's the allusion to Ezekiel 34. And here's four things they're described as. Rainless clouds, leafless trees, wild waves, and wandering stars. Now, I wish I had time to go through all of those. I do not. They're in your outline. What this is four allusions to that which looks promising, that which looks good, but in the end is destruction.
Yeah. That's the world, isn't it? That's the devil just luring you in. You know, look at all this, the sweets, the goods, you know, and you think that'll do me, that'll make me feel good, and then of course it doesn't. And so these are the people who slipped into the church. They're trying to corrupt the morals of the new Christians. And what's their reward? The blackness of darkness forever. Okay? Again, one of Melville's favorite phrases. Don't you think for a minute that he didn't know the context of it? You can, by the way, if you're interested, look at Melville's own New Testament with his marginalia in it. I think it's, if you just Google Melville's marginalia, you'll find the website. Pretty cool. You can thumb through his library, not just his New Testament, but a lot of his books, and see kind of what marks he made in the margins. I remember sitting one time next to a drunk professor when I was in graduate school. There is truth in wine, as the saying goes. So I asked him, after he said something very esoteric about some literary theorist or some critical paper, do you ever read, the primary texts anymore? He stared into his beer, wouldn't make eye contact, took a drink, and said, "No, I spend all my time on the criticism. That's where the action is." I remember even at the time this was profoundly sad to me. This was, like asking your priest if he ever reads the Bible anymore and discovering that no, he spends all his time reading biblical criticism. The classics will not tolerate this sort of disrespect, and those who regard them will be banished to the blackness of darkness. And I'm not fucking kidding. Moby-Dick is a great mirror, and the mirror is a test. If all you see in it is yourself, then you miss the miracle of the mirror itself. But if you can study the mirror as a mirror, understand how it looks and how it works and so on, stand to the side and try to penetrate its mystery. If all you see when you read Moby-Dick is yourself, you see little. If you're, say, a self-identified queer Jew, and Moby-Dick seems like a very Jewish and queer book to you, you're kind of disrespecting the book, or at least humiliating yourself in showing yourself as one who only sees yourself in the book. And I think the book won't tolerate such egotism for long. Every brainwashed libtard who reads Moby-Dick and calls Ahab a type of Hitler ought to feel shame when they read. In the key chapter of the entire novel, chapter 99, the doubloon, this is in my opinion, but I mean, everybody agrees chapter 99 matters very much. And when they read Ahab's, so what happens in this scene is, I'll say more about this later because I'll do probably a whole episode almost on it, but all the men, Ahab has nailed up a Spanish doubloon to the mainmast and said, whoever raises me the whale, that is, whoever spots the whale, gets to keep this Spanish doubloon. I looked it up one time. It's a lot of money. It would be worth like $2,600 now or something. So all the men are like, yes, good. And at one point in the novel, in chapter 99, they all go to look at the gold doubloon, and what they see in it is sort of, they all interpret it very differently, okay? But here's what Ahab says as he looks at the doubloon, quote, "There's something ever egotistical in mountaintops and towers and all other grand and lofty things. Look here, 3 peaks as proud as Lucifer. The firm tower, that is Ahab. The volcano, that is Ahab. The courageous, the undaunted, and victorious fowl, that too is Ahab. All are Ahab. And this round gold, and this round gold is but the image of the rounder globe, which, like a magician's glass, to each and every man in turn, but mirrors back his own mysterious self." So, how these libtards do not feel caught in this trap, how it does not pierce their little solipsistic mental world, I can't imagine. Moby-Dick works exactly the opposite on me. I feel challenged on every page. I feel accused, I feel torn down, caught off guard. It keeps me on my own sins, But they go on, these people, calling Ahab Hitler, assured that Moby-Dick is a book that's all about them. Do they just love reading Judith Butler? And guess what? Judith Butler just happens to be the perfect framework for finally understanding the book. This is how it works for them. How surprising. The point is, Moby-Dick is a world, and the world really isn't merely a reflection of you. If you read it, prepare to read it twice, and then every couple of years. It will grow as you grow, and you'll see new things every time. None of this is true of literary criticism. Listen to me. Stay away from secondary sources. This podcast has a new mantra today. Primary sources, gentlemen. Primary sources. A couple years ago, I went to a conference on Moby-Dick in Manhattan, and I presented a paper alongside the woman you're going to hear in this next clip, Katie McGettigan. She's talking with Melvin Bragg on the BBC's In Our Time. I think she's making a fair point in this audio clip about authority. But consider how the tug of war over the meaning of Moby-Dick is in part about who gets to decide just that. Is there some international elite composed mostly of university professors who get to rule on what Moby-Dick means? I don't think so, and I think Melville composed it almost precisely to be resistant to this kind of ruling. Because even in his day, the critics tried to establish themselves as authorities in much the same way as our contemporary pundits do with the news. I'm making a postmodernist point here. The idea is that, at least with certain texts and maybe art objects, meaning is, and even is intended to be, ultimately elusive. I'm sure many of you will agree with me that it's important not to let rootless cosmopolitan globalist elites decide what our favorite books mean. But think also of the other side of this claim. This podcast also rejects the idea that meaning can be totally determined by any institutional authority. And this would include, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church, or whatever moral authority you want to believe gets to finally rule. there are certain upper echelons of artistic creation that simply cannot be closed by interpretive authorities. And I think the artists do this on purpose. Melville certainly seems to have intended to force the problem of interpretation on us. And there are many passages where it's like he's meta examining this very problem, right, in the book. So how can we be interpreters? Go back and listen to that reading of Stephen Crane's story, The Open Boat. Okay, listen to Katie McGettigan give an interesting example.
It's about what a leader is. How should a leader operate? What's the difference between a leader and a follower? And I guess one of the major questions the novel asks is what should a legitimate leader, because after all he's captured the ship, so he has authority, but what does he do with that authority?
Kate, you want to come in?
Yeah, I suppose I would just add to that that idea of legitimate authority, but also how far authority can actually reach is a really important thing in Moby-Dick. So, yes, Ahab nails the doubloon to the mast, and he says, this is the reward for sighting Moby-Dick. This is whoever sights Moby-Dick will get this doubloon. So he tries to essentially control the meaning of that coin in the same way that he tries to control the meaning of Moby-Dick, tries to control the whole ship. And to an extent he can do that, but we also have a really interesting later chapter in Moby-Dick called The Doubloon, where we see all the different members of the crew looking at this coin, and they all transform its meaning into something different.
Okay, so you get this idea, right? I hope. I mean, we'll return to it. It's ultra important. It's one of the main themes of the book, is basically who gets to decide and how is meaning made and agreed upon. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, I suppose. This stuff about authority and totalitarianism and the democratic imagination and the unavoidable responsibility of interpretation, it's all important, like I said, crucially important. But first, back up with me a bit. First, read paragraph 1 with me. And maybe we can say a word about the first chapter. It's interesting that the first paragraph comes after 7 pages of prefatory material, extracts and so on, these basically every citation mentioning whales in classic literature. So this is chapter 1, Loomings. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There's nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. So this is our narrator. This is Ishmael. He is basically depressed and wants to go sailing to sort of shake the depression. Okay, this is who we're dealing with, and he's the one who's going to narrate everything with us. In some ways, he will try to determine the meaning of the text for us, right? He's our only access point, as I said in the last episode, to what happens. But he also makes judgments for us, and I think we can sometimes refuse his judgments. I mentioned that sermon in chapter 2 about the blackness of darkness in the black church. The second sermon of the novel takes all of chapter 9 up, and if you've ever seen the Gregory Peck movie version of Moby-Dick, you'll remember this as the scene where Orson Welles boomed his sermon from the pulpit shaped like a whaleboat after climbing up a ragged rope ladder. The sermon, and remember, this sermon is written by Melville, a skeptic, darn near an atheist, age 31. This sermon is the best sermon I've ever heard. It's about Jonah, and I wish I could read it all aloud to you. It helps if you've read the very short 3.5-page book in the Bible, Jonah. And honestly, if you haven't read Jonah, I mean, my gosh, what are you doing with your life listening to this podcast instead of the book of Jonah? You don't have 12 minutes to read the book of Jonah? Give me a break. Unfollow. But I want to read 2 little excerpts from this sermon to show, again, that Melville himself, the writer, had what Keats called negative capability. Yes, he could doubt everything. But like Dostoevsky, who said that he wrote the lines of his atheist Ivan so much more quickly than the lines of his saintly Alyosha, Melville could imagine, truly, in 3 dimensions, without condescending or exaggerating, the minds of others. Here's the first excerpt. This is, again, this is in a sermon delivered by Father Mapple at the little church right before they set sail. And it's about Jonah in the scene where he's down in the berth of inside the ship, like thinking about running away from God, right? Quote, like one who after a night of drunken revelry hees to his bed, still reeling, but with conscience yet pricking him, as the plungings of the Roman racehorse, but so much the more strike his steel tags into him. As one who, in that miserable plight, still turns and turns in giddy anguish, praying God for annihilation until the fit be past. And at last, amid the whirl of woe he feels, a deep stupor steals over him, as over the man who bleeds to death, for conscience is the wound, and there's naught to staunch it. So, after sore wrestlings in his birth, Jonah's prodigy of ponderous misery drags him drowning down to sleep. What a scene. This is Melville imagining the Bible story into 3 dimensions and like kind of inflating it, right? And what you've got is basically like the image of Jonah as a drunk, as if he just got, the way the drunk is like, oh, I'll never do this again. I feel so sick. God rescue me. That's Jonah here, stabbed by conscience. I hope you listened to my episode on the Iliad and analogies, by the way, as higher thinking. These are some of the most vivid and eternal analogies I've ever read, and they stab at me. If this doesn't make you think hard about your past sins and make you pause before committing another, I don't know what might cause you to repent. And it gets even more intense. As the sermon is wrapping up, the thunderous Father Mapple almost hollers, quote, "Then God spake unto the fish, and from the shuddering cold and blackness of the sea the whale came breaching up towards the warm and pleasant sun, and all the delights of air and earth, and vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. When the word of the Lord came a second time, and Jonah bruised and beaten, his ears like 2 seashells, still multitudinously murmuring of the ocean, Jonah did the Almighty's bidding. And what was that bidding, shipmates? To preach the truth to the face of falsehood. That was it. This, shipmates, this is that other lesson. And woe to that pilot of the living God who slights it. Woe to him! This world charms from gospel duty. Woe to him who seeks to pour oil upon the waters when God has brewed them into a gale. Woe to him who seeks to please rather than to appall. Woe to him whose good name is more to him than goodness. Woe to him who in this world courts not dishonor. Woe to him who would not be true, even though to be false were salvation. Yea, woe to him who, as the great pilot Paul has it, while preaching to others is himself a castaway. Oh man, wow! Where's my old friend VDR? Do you get to preach anymore, brother? I swear. Try memorizing this. Just yell it one fine Sunday at a lukewarm congregation. Would that they would have ears to hear. Again, in case what I'm saying isn't clear, what I'm trying to do here is to claim that Moby-Dick is very morally serious, and that mockers and scoffers who read it incautiously and without introspecting not only do an injustice to Melville, but worse to themselves. As Ishmael proclaims from the top of the masthead after issuing a warning about not getting distracted up there, daydreaming while you're supposed to be watching for whales, "Heed it well, ye pantheists!" I am, of course, going to do numerous episodes on Ralph Waldo Emerson at some point, but here I want to mention just 2 claims, very nearly without context, from his most famous essay, Nature. Actually, the first is a quote from Plotinus that Emerson used as an epigraph before beginning his essay Nature. But that's sort of the point. Emerson chose this quote from Plotinus, and it wasn't like everybody was quoting Plotinus in the 1830s. So listen, Plotinus said, quote, "Nature is but an image or imitation of wisdom, the last thing of the soul. Nature being a thing which doth only do, but not know." Now this is an absolutely mind-blowing claim, bordering on a supernaturalist perspective. The idea is that everything we see and perceive, nature here meaning not just the green stuff, but literally everything in the universe, materially, is all merely a reflection of what is actual. This is Platonic and even Hermetic, right? As above, so below. If we say with Starbuck, that's the first mate, that Ahab's quest to kill the whale was demonic, or with Ishmael that it was mad, then we have to first reject the Emersonian view, because in Emerson's view, the whale, like the praying mantis and the green lizard from my episode on the Upanishads, must mean something. It is an avatar of some divine or demonic thing. That's the quickest possible summary I can give of Emerson, who did, by the way, have access to the earliest English translations of the Indian Vedas. Now, I mention all this because Melville knew and even admired Emerson. For instance, after attending in person one of Emerson's lectures, Melville wrote in his journal of Emerson, quote, "I love all men who dive. Any fish can swim near the surface, but it takes a great whale to go downstairs 5 miles or more. And if he don't attain the bottom, why all the lead in Galena can't fashion the plummet that will." I'm not talking of Mr. Emerson now, but of the whole corps of thought divers that have been diving and coming up again with bloodshot eyes since the beginning of the world. And this further reinforces my idea that Melville has negative capability, because he does not exactly agree with Emerson. In fact, later he remarks of Emersonianism, quote, "God help the poor fellow who squares his life according to this." But in spite of the differences in their conclusions, Melville recognized a serious person in Emerson, and for that he respected him. Get serious about your life, about your choices, about your values. Commit, right? Do not remain lukewarm. In all this, I think we have to begin to see that no one is more serious than Ahab. No one is a deeper diver. Melville might not wholly agree with Ahab, but he understands him, and he respects that seriousness. Speaking of dialogical thinking, I want to encourage all of you, really plead with all of you, to participate in the show by leaving comments for me on YouTube, especially. Not so that we, fool the algorithm or something, but because, can't you tell? This is why I'm doing this show. I really long for interaction, for dialogue. I want disagreement. Thank you to Philip Daniel, who challenged me recently on the idea that Jesus possibly speaking Greek might have been an overreach. I'll keep researching. Leave links. I also got a comment recently from someone on Twitter, Mark Butterworth, who said, "Never finished Moby-Dick, can't now. Hard to appreciate writers who are tending and end up so far from God truth." That's interesting, and I get what he's saying. It's a reasonable criticism. All that stuff about writing a wicked book, and Dreyfus's commentary that Melville was opposed to Christianity. I get it. This makes it an especially challenging book for Christians. In fact, in one letter to Hawthorne, Melville said, quote, "This is the book's motto," the secret one, "Ego non baptizo te in nomine, but make out the rest for yourself." That is, I baptize you not in the name, right? So he's saying not in the name of the Father, but presumably in the name of the devil or something. But can a man who seeks truth really do damage to God? Won't he find in the end God in spite of himself? I think of the so-called via negativa, the path of the negative way, forged by pseudo-Dionysius in the West, and with its own tradition in India, where the chant, Neti, neti, neti is muttered as one looks at this object and then this object and then the next object. Not this, not this, not this. In other words, the search for God is a process sort of like, the search for Moby-Dick, a process of elimination that sort of, you say, this isn't God, this isn't God, this isn't God. That's sort of how the book works. I heard an interesting clip, actually, about aesthetics recently. Listen to this one, and then I'll try to comment.
Thank you very much, Melvin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, so the motion of the House is the proper aim of art is aesthetic excellence, not moral efficacy. And the way I understand this motion is the following. Art can do many things, but what it is for something as art, that is the pursuit of artistic goals, is to aim for aesthetic excellence, and that's where its primary value lies. It might be able to do many other things, but if it's aiming at moral efficacy and not aesthetic excellence, then we're bound to have bowed out, and it's bound to fail.
Yeah, so aesthetic excellence. I mean, there's a lot to say about this. Like Poe wrote some really interesting essays about, avoiding what he called the heresy of the didactic. So didacticism is it's what we would call propaganda, right? Like moral inculcation. And any art that tries to do that, which basically you get, it's like socialist realism would try to do this, right? Like that's what, on one end, and then there's the art of degeneracy on the other end that tries to encourage you that nothing means anything and who cares. But all of that art is garbage because it's trying to inculcate a message. And what this guy says, and he's right, is that the highest art sort of aims at just art itself at some level. So Moby-Dick clearly, to me, doesn't arrange itself as a propaganda piece. It's not trying to indoctrinate you. I was actually reading, let me see if I can find this real quick. It was interesting. Here, I'm looking at that podcast by Talia Lavin called Moby-Dick Energy. And one of the reviews, it's right on the first page. I didn't even dig through these very far, but the guy says, 3 stars, 3 stars. He says, I'll listen when I can because no doubt this is my favorite book. But, the contagion known as 2020 politics has made its way here as well. He says of this podcast, it's about Moby-Dick, the podcast. But he says they do a good job of disclaiming explicit takeaways. But to me, this book, Moby-Dick, is a universe away from social commentary. The more times I read Moby-Dick, it becomes increasingly apparent there are many Moby-Dicks. I commend the creator of this podcast for stepping out and talking about a text that truly matters, but for a book that has made me tremble and weep, the contextual traps of 2020 stink. And I couldn't agree more. No offense, I guess, to Talia Lavin, but I think she's missing the mark if Moby-Dick is about Judaism and queerness. You don't need Moby-Dick to talk about Judaism and queerness. You're just kind of pissing on the book at that point. So Moby-Dick instead arranges itself as an invitation to exploration. It's not trying to indoctrinate you, and how refreshing, right? I often think about this, about how so many people don't have podcasts. Why aren't you posting? What are you doing with your life? Why aren't you saying what you think? And of course, I get it. The answer is you can get fired for saying what you think in 2020, for mildly deviating from the required set of interpretations. And this all makes me sad because I genuinely, and I do think you'll pick this, you might, if this is the first podcast of me you've listened to, you might not believe it. But if you hang in there with me for a while, I think you'll detect this. I genuinely invite people to say shit. Just say it. Who cares if you're right? If you're not, someone will slide into your DMs or your comments on YouTube and correct you, and then you'll learn. That's the point. That's the whole point of this. The dialogue, thesis, counter-thesis, produces a synthesis. This is how we learn. My God, in fact, it makes me feel how are we going to learn? if there's only this one narrative, and you can't discuss things, if you can't read Moby-Dick as a kind of invitation to fascism, let's say, then we're never going to learn anything about Moby-Dick, because no one cares to just memorize other people's judgments about things and regurgitate them. Moby-Dick tacks back and forth, always missing the mark, I suppose, but in that way it teaches you how to sail, how to do the journey. Get a little lost, it's fine. Take a new measurement of the horizon and the stars, begin again. When it comes to Moby-Dick as art, its main purpose is definitely aesthetic, not moral. But here's the interesting thing about this, about all art. Such an overwhelmingly grand art, its main purpose is definitely, like I said, aesthetic. But such an overwhelmingly grand aesthetic purpose cannot help but provoke moral introspection. Unless you're an idiot. But for me, for sure, right? I mean, beauty is beauty. Yes. But it is also truth. It is also goodness. So Moby-Dick might be explicitly, in terms of the language at times, a wicked or heretical book at one level. But at another level, it is one of the most impressive artistic works of the modern era, certainly, if not all time. Everyone who reads it is awed by it as a whole. And no kidding, awed. A-W-E-D. Awed by it, right? I mean, when was the last time you were awed by anything? People will post links, look at this, look at this. It's all just bullshit. You just smile, it goes away, you forget about it. I'm talking about awe, and in this case, you might have to make the journey to Florence, Italy. You could be awed by looking at the Florence Cathedral. But if you can't do that, Moby-Dick costs $7.99, and to read it takes 50 hours. And when you're done, you will feel awed. And what do I mean by that? I mean Melville might have been wrong about certain things. You understand what I'm saying? He might have even tried to be wicked in certain ways. But he must have been serious. Okay, no mere joker or surface skimmer writes a book like this. You can't. It took too much work, if nothing else. The composition of this story is itself just, it just makes my brain do that tingle thing, okay? All right, there's one more chapter I wanted us to look a little closer at today called the Ramadan. And I picked this one to look a little closer at just because, it's not my favorite chapter or anything. I think it's chapter 17. How embarrassing. And, okay, the first thing, the Ramadan is obviously the Islamic holiday. But Ishmael, who's narrating, titles it the Ramadan and uses that term to describe a scene that features his new friend Queequeg praying to his little idol. It's an idol. It's a little wooden idol, Yojo, that he, sets up in the shrine thing, and then he meditates for 12 hours, in front of this thing, burning incense and praying to it. And just listen to some of what, I want you to hear what I think of as the sort of shallowness of Ishmael, the unseriousness of Ishmael. Yeah, he's an open-minded Democrat or whatever, but he can't appreciate the deep spiritual thing that's going on with Queequeg. He thinks it's kind of just a farce, or why are you wasting your time, right? He's so Sam Harris-y, Ishmael is. He says this, third sentence into the chapter 17. I cherish the greatest respect towards everybody's religious obligations, never mind how comical, and could not find it in my heart to undervalue even a congregation of ants worshipping a toadstool, or those other creatures in certain parts of our earth who, with a degree of footmanism quite unprecedented in other planets, bow down before the torso of a deceased landed proprietor merely on account of the inordinate possessions yet owned and rented in his name. I say, we good Presbyterian Christians should be charitable in these things, and not fancy ourselves so vastly superior to other mortals, pagans and whatnot, because of their half-crazy conceits on these subjects. There was Queequeg now, certainly entertaining the most absurd notions about Yojo and his Ramadan, but what of that? Queequeg thought he knew what he was about, I suppose. He seemed to be content, and there let him rest. All our arguing with him would not avail. Let him be, I say, and heaven have mercy on us all, Presbyterians and pagans alike. For we are all somehow dreadfully cracked about the head and sadly needing mending. I mean, like, okay, I get your point. The first time I read this, I thought like Ishmael. So, like, that gives you I get what Ishmael's saying here. It's nice, it's easygoing. He's, as Hubert Dreyfuss is so fond of pointing out, he's not an evangelical. He's barely Presbyterian. He's Presbyterian, like, by birth, but he doesn't seem to take it seriously. Skipping a few pages toward the end of this chapter, he says, so Ishmael, like I said, literally sits there with the door locked for a whole day. Ishmael, like, peers in at him through the keyhole or something and sees him sitting in there, and he's like, what the hell? He thinks he's dead, actually, for a while. And then he says, now, as I before hinted, I have no objection to any person's religion, be it what it may, so long as that person does not kill or insult any other person, because that other person don't believe it also. But when a man's religion becomes really frantic, when it is a positive torment to him, and, in fine, makes this earth of ours an uncomfortable inn to lodge in, then I think it high time to take that individual aside and argue the point with him. So this is America, isn't it? This is Ishmael the American, essentially saying, like, freedom of religion, of course, but, like, don't let it affect you at all, especially not 6.5 days a week. Like, don't bring your stuff to work. Don't let it make you do fasting days or, penance or, don't pray too much. You get all caught up in that stuff. And I get this viewpoint, but it's so condescending. And in fact, if I had to pick a tutor or a mentor or a guru, I would pick Queequeg ahead of Ishmael, because what can I learn from Ishmael? Like, Ishmael is like a Sesame Street episode here. He's like, okay, everything's okay, do whatever you want, there's not much going on here. But, to me, like, I want to know about the will that it takes to fast for 24 hours and to pray for 12 straight hours. Like, how does Queequeg do that? Ishmael says, here's his lecture to Queequeg, who's like, apparently, a spiritually profound person, right? And he the new atheist, like, he read a book by Richard Dawkins, and he's going to go up to Queequeg and he says, Queequeg, get into bed just now and lie and listen to me. I then went on, beginning with the rise and progress of the primitive religions and coming down to the various religions of the present time, during which time I labored to show Queequeg that all these Lents, Ramadans, and prolonged ham squattings in cold, cheerless rooms were stark nonsense. Bad for the health, useless for the soul, opposed, in short, to the obvious laws of hygiene and common sense. I told him, too, that he, being in other things such an extremely sensible and sagacious savage, it pained me very badly pained him to see him now so deplorably foolish about this ridiculous Ramadan of his. Besides, argued I, fasting makes the body cave in, hence the spirit caves in, and all thoughts born of a fast must necessarily be half-starved. This is, to me, this sounds like some college sophomore who discovered atheism and thinks he's, like, enlightened. And again, I'm reading you all this because, Ishmael is our reporter. Ishmael is our pundit. Ishmael is the one who gives analysis throughout the book of what's going on. And I think Melville is not Ishmael. Melville is inviting you to look at a little lower layer with him and sort of see past what Ishmael can see. Toward the end of the chapter, Ishmael says, after all, I do not think that my remarks about religion made much impression upon Queequeg, because in the first place he somehow seemed dull of hearing on that important subject, unless considered from his own point of view. And, in the second place, he did not more than 1/3 understand me, couch my ideas simply as I would. And finally, he no doubt thought he knew a good deal more about the true religion than I did. He looked at me with a sort of condescending concern and compassion, as though he thought it a great pity that such a sensible young man should be so hopelessly lost to evangelical pagan piety. Okay, I mean, that's about it for this episode, but I hope I've given you, like, the main argument of this episode is that Moby-Dick ought to only encourage this one thing, and that is seriousness. Like, yes, and by the way, it's hilarious at times. There's great humor in it, but, like, the overarching takeaway for me at a non-propagandistic level, for sure, is think harder. You know, it all matters a great deal. Of course, there must be meaning in all this at some point, you know? Like, there's this, like, let me see if I can find it real quick. I didn't have this one marked, but I mean, you know, I almost have this stuff memorized. It's like, all things. Let's see. Meditation and water are wedded forever. That's nice, isn't it? The ungraspable phantom of life. All things must mean something, basically, he says. Let's see if I can find it. Well, in any case, it looks like I can't, but, oh, here we go. Wait, no. Almost done, I guess. Yeah, okay. I'll have to come back to this part. I'll start the next episode with all things, else all things are little worth, is the idea. Everything must have meaning, else all things have little worth. Okay, I'll see you next time. We're going to keep going on Moby-Dick. I don't have the theme of the next episode, but I will be focusing on chapters 36 to 42, which are sort of the first high point of the novel, and it's where I think most people detect that the novel, like, picks up its pace in terms of the plot, because before chapter 36, mostly you're, like, hearing about the ins and outs of how you get on a whale ship and meeting some of the characters, and you know, I mean, they don't even leave Nantucket until, like, chapter, 21 or something. So it takes a while to get started. But in chapter 36, Ahab's going to give his quarterdeck speech, which is like the pep rally speech, the announcement of our purpose, you know. And so we'll talk in the next episode, no doubt, more about authority and about the idea of, like, kind of like about the weakness of democracy and the fun that there might be if some strongman dictator did take over and say, this is what we're about, you know, and encourage you with things like money and, you know, blood oaths and so on. All right, everybody. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Like I said, you know, Moby-Dick is free online. Costs $7 to order it. Like, it's not too late. Get your copy. I'm going to do at least 3 more episodes on Moby-Dick. I'm in the groove now. Reading it. I love reading it, man. They're so quotable. I'm going to put up quotes on my Instagram. I think the Instagram, if you search Godward Podcast, you'll find it. Let me get the title of my Instagram. It's just one word, Godward Podcast. Should be able to take you to my Instagram, and I'm putting up good visuals there for you. There's a lot of memes happening in my Twitter timeline, which is at Godward16, and you can find the link to the Patreon page there. See you next time on the Godward Podcast.